So if you wouldn't mind responding to that, that would be helpful. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat feature and just send a private message to me. I'm pleased to be the host this afternoon. Again, for any that I haven't met, my name is Joel Zantingh, and I am the Canadian coordinator for the Peace and Reconciliation Network. And PRN is a commission of the World Evangelical Alliance. And it is our sincere desire to see a world that is living in peace, reconciled in Jesus Christ. We know that reconciliation is never an event. It's always a process, and it's something that requires our constant conforming to the way in which God wants us to live in the world. And in the light of issues that need particular peace and reconciliation, we know that that is an ongoing struggle. And so today is an opportunity to lean in and hear more from a Middle East perspective on what's been happening, and as well to think about healing as an opportunity to listen in to the Palestinian and Israeli past in order to look forward. And this is a beautiful aspect of not only truth-telling, but sharpening our understanding of history in order to be present in support for all those who are harmed in the midst of ongoing conflicts. And then we're going to have a time of facilitated dialogue later, which I will lead, and there'll be an opportunity for you to share. Once again, as questions form, you can post them in the Q&A section. So those are my introductory comments this afternoon. And I'm going to ask Salim Munayer at this time just to extend his greetings and then to give any update he wants regarding the Middle East, North Africa.
Oh, thank you very much, Joel. There is a lot of people here that I got to know many years ago, and also recent visit to British Columbia, having really time of fellowship, building a friendship with many people. So thank you for being here, and I think you're going to have a treat, as Jack is probably one of the experts in the world and knowledgeable about the reality right now on the ground. He is having firsthand access to information, and he will tell you more what he does. So if you have any questions, especially about the situation in the Gaza Strip, but more also about the deterioration of situation in the West Bank right now. It's getting worse and worse every day. And so this is something that he, other than history, can fill you in with information and knowledge about it. Concerning the MENA region of PRN, we are really excited because myself and Martin Akkad, that he is a president Near East School of Theology in Lebanon. We have been invited next week for a week to share 3 sessions at Blue Med Conference. Blue Med Conference is the most important evangelical conference of the MENA region, where hundreds of people will come, leaders from the area and also from the international community that are engaged within the MENA region. I will be presenting exegesis on 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and then Martin and I will be presenting the theology that we are working as a team in the last 2 years to develop in the context of our situation. And then we have a third about narratives, that is another one that is very important. This year theme of the Blue Med on peace and reconciliation, and I think that is reflecting a shift that's happening for many churches and organizations, the realization that it's a very much neglected but much needed area for a church to be engaged. At the same time, we are gearing up for our gathering in Istanbul in March between the 20th and 23rd. And I'm really excited because we're going to have people coming from Sudan, the head of the National Council of the churches there. We're going to have people from Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, and also the Gulf, Jordan. So we are expanding. So why we are meeting in Istanbul? Because the division and the preventing the ability of people of the MENA region to come together because of the borders and the political reality that we are living in. Istanbul is the only, or Turkey is the only country grant visa for people from the MENA region and other country is impossible to travel or illegal, or you can be charged. For example, any relationship between people from my area and Lebanon or other country like Algeria can put people in danger. So the fact that the people are coming together from all those countries is a courageous act of their action. And what we'll be doing, one thing that we will looking into the reality. The reality in the MENA region for the last year and a half has changed drastically. Things are not the same. And one of the realization is that we all have in the team and others around the MENA that the church is not doing well in the situation. The silence of the church, especially of the West, the complacent, and as a result, the name of Jesus is not being honored right now in our area. So how we are as living in the country are going to be an instrument of blessing, an instrument of bringing and acting for what we're commanded in 2 Corinthians to be ambassador for the King of Peace. So in the context of our reality and situation that we are. So the theology that we are developing, it's not kind of empirical academic, is a theology coming from the field. We sit together and all of us together are working on it. And we are looking into developing approach that will challenge long century structure of injustice that are preventing a blessing to all the people of the Middle East, internal structure and external structure. And the second most important is the next generation. The generation of Jack and others, that they are the leaders that we are want to empower them, open the door for them, and enable them to take the role that they have to do. As you know, in my region, in our churches, like many other places around the world, women and young people are not invited to the table, are not invited in leadership. And as a result, we have lost very gifted young men and women to be engaged with the church. You know, and you heard about the genocide in Gaza. You hear about the war in Lebanon. The situation is not good, and we should not leave to political leaders the only voice. The kingdom of God has to be lived and demonstrated in our area. And we all know how the mess that our political leaders have left it. So in that note, I'm saying this is what Jesus left to us, that we need to preach the kingdom of God and his goodness to all people. So we appreciate very much your prayer for protection, for visa. We are having people that we have to conceal the name and photos as they're taking personal risk in coming. Many of the people coming are believers from Muslim backgrounds. And so this is another dimension that is very important. Young and women, that if that will be known in their prospective country, that will endanger them not only because they believe in Jesus, it's because they're meeting people from the other side of the wall. So appreciate your prayer for protection, anointing, and of course, all of that is costly too. So all our people are paying high price to come personally. They have to request visa, just visa. In some of the country, it will cost people $250. That's more than half a price of an airplane ticket. And also traveling from far, like Sudan, Egypt, to airports and stuff, and paying other bills. So they are sacrificing their time, sacrificing money in order to attend. So thank you very much for your prayer and your support.
Really appreciate you taking some time to unpack some of those important next steps. And we will return to the project at the end of the call today, where people can contribute toward your team gathering together. And we pray God's blessing on you as you continue to prepare for Blue Med and critical week for you to be able to share in this theology of reconciliation. So with that, I know that you're not able to stay entirely on the call, Salim, but you're welcome to stay as long as you're able as we transition over to Jack.
Well, he's better than me. So really, seriously, not because he's my son. He's really the expert in the world on those issues.
With that, I'll just say a few things about Jack. It is an honor to have you with us today, and grateful for you giving us some time. And just as you get your presentation queued up, I'll just share a few facts about Jack, that he was born again, son of Salim, but British mother, Palestinian Christian, citizen of Israel, father. He attended an Israeli Jewish school, and he has a BA in Sociology and Criminology from the University of York, and a Master of Arts in Human Rights and Transitional Justice from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he's working currently in the humanitarian sector, has interfaced, coordinated with the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Accompaniment program in Palestine and Israel, and has been active in many bridge building initiatives such as the Jerusalem-Belfast Forum and advocacy groups like Christ at the Checkpoint. Those may be familiar with to you as well. And so we're grateful to have his expertise and voice as he leads us through this presentation. To heal, we must remember. So Jack, officially welcome, and grateful to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to speak to you on these difficult topics. As Salim said, we're having some difficult days here. Yesterday, many of you would have seen in the news the parading of coffins with Israeli hostages who have been killed in Gaza. 5 minutes before you all joined, a 13-year-old Palestinian boy was shot and killed in Hebron by an Israeli soldier. So it's endless waves of violence and horrors that are accompanying us at the moment. And I think that a lot of people in the world, including the church, have been eager to try and treat the symptoms of what we're facing here, but not true healing, which is dealing with the root causes. So I have before me a presentation which covers a big chunk of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are not going to go through all of it. It's impossible in half an hour. But I've put a link in the chat to this presentation. It's a public presentation. So if there's anything that I've rushed through, or if you'd like to visit this at another point, by all means, please feel free to do so. The presentation has not been updated for the past few years. And to be honest with you, with everything that's happened over the past year and a half, I'm not so sure that I would know how to do that at this point. But I'm eager to see what questions you have, what you have in mind, and we can explore those together. I think a good starting point for the conflict's context is not Isaac and Ishmael and Abraham, but really the rise of nationalism and sort of modern history in the 18th and 19th century. This is where a lot of nations started becoming independent from the different empires that controlled them. I think I'm speaking to Canadians here, or all Canadians, but if not, you can see that for a long period of time, the world was essentially divided into empires, where wherever you were living, you had some umbrella power that controlled your area directly. And that was, of course, true for this region as well, which was the Ottoman Empire, which, as it slowly started shrinking and losing its control in the Middle East, and with the rise of nationalism, people started questioning whether this is really the system that they want to live under. Specifically for, we're going to be looking both at Israeli nationalism, so Zionism, and then Palestinian nationalism. So, as I said, prior to the 19th century, people tended to organize themselves in small cities, in principalities under the larger structure of the empire. However, over time, people came to view themselves as a unified society or nation. So I share things in common with my neighbors that I don't share with this power or governance that is hanging over me. So in the context of Israel, that begins with Zionism, which is the drive for the return of Jews to and sovereignty in Eretz Israel. And this begins in the context of anti-Semitism. So this is the Dreyfus trials in France, where a Jewish soldier in France was discriminated against and had judgments ruled against him because he's Jewish. And this is a picture from the newspaper at the time, and I think it's very telling that in the background you have a big painting of Christ being crucified, where this injustice is taking place. So this and many other anti-Semitic events across Europe really pushed for this idea of a Jewish political entity and a Jewish national homeland. And so Theodor Herzl turned Zionism into a political movement, where he sought after wealthy Jews who could buy land in Palestine and other world leaders that would support this cause. And eventually he found the most success with the British. If we return to nationalism on the Palestinian side, also there was movements and changes taking place in Palestinian society under the Ottoman Empire. Palestinians saw their connection to the land as self-evident, right? So Palestinians say, well, we've been here for generations and generations. This is really our land. This is where we belong. And there was a very strong Palestinian economic boom, which brought with it education and a political thought on having independent rule. And Palestinians saw themselves, and see themselves until today, as the custodians of the religious sites. And this contributes to a collective purpose as a people to maintain the history and religious importance of the land. So Palestinian identity throughout history has changed. You've had lots of different empires take over. Palestine as a land was very much a bridge between continents, so you had a constant move of people. Eventually, Palestine was Arabized with the Islamic conquest, and it until today is the dominant cultural identity. However, specifically, if I'm speaking as a Christian Palestinian, we have a rich heritage influence of Armenians, Greeks, Phoenicians, and Jews. For those of you that would like to read more about what I would consider the golden period and for peaceful coexistence in this land, is the book The Storyteller of Jerusalem, which is the diary of a Palestinian Christian musician in the Old City. And he describes the different changes going on in the land during the end of the 18th century. But he also describes, I think in a really interesting way, how much people respected each other's religions and got along, whether that's Christians and Muslims, Christians and Jews. There's always this mix of relationships that took place, which eventually fell apart. So for those of you that want to read more on that, I would really encourage you to read this book. So Palestinian nationalism really increased in the thought process of many Palestinians by encountering the other. So one of the things that strengthens our identity the most is when we encounter people who are different from us, because it solidifies who we are. And so Palestinians, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, were suddenly encountering a lot of British people. They were encountering the Zionist movement and other Arab nations that had an interest in the land, which was solidifying the Palestinian identity. Another important factor is the rise of political Islam, where Islam was intertwined with political movements across the region, where there was a new focus on the holy sites and keeping them under Muslim sovereignty. So the British have managed to drive out the Ottomans and have to decide what to do with this land. And in the span of 3 years, the British managed to promise the land to the Arabs, to themselves, and to the Zionist movement, all in the span of 3 years. What could possibly go wrong, right? So we have the McMahon-Hussein letter, where Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs within the territories in the limits and boundaries proposed, which include Palestine. They had drawn this map with the French, dividing up the north of the Middle East for France, and then sort of the south and far east to the British, with all the different strategic interests that they had. And then we have the Balfour Declaration, where there's His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So everybody believes that they now have this legitimacy to establish finally an independent entity. And so, of course, this caused a lot of tension at the time. Now, if we talk about the British approach to Palestinians and to Palestine, we have colonial racism, we have financial and political interests, and then we also have Christian Zionism and prophetic destiny. So if we think about financial and political influence, there's a clear attempt by the British to connect different seas and ports and oil, which was being used more and more. And so they clearly had their own financial and political interests to have a strong hold in the region. But some of the first sort of British scouts, which came to the land to see what type of control, what type of influence, how can we reshape the reality of this land? This is some of the letters that were written back to Britain about the Palestinians, about the Arabs. And you can see the language that's used here is consistent with other colonial entities which were taking over so-called savage lands, where they described the intellectual status of the natives as a whole, I should place very little higher than that of a genuine savage. And so this was really an interesting lens into how the Palestinians and specifically have experienced these changes in the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see that there's a lot of religious language used as well. Balfour, who made the Balfour Declaration, was a Christian Zionist himself. And so the church, or parts of the church, has accompanied this process of the British Empire in deciding the geopolitical fate of both Israelis and Palestinians in this land. It's very important to remember that. So British mandate, as it's moving on, started to face a lot of challenges. Palestinians saw the mandate as linked to Zionism, where they're favoring Jews over the Palestinians who lived here, especially with the announcement of the Balfour Declaration. There were lots of laws that were being changed in favor of Jewish land purchases, and there were tensions growing around the holy sites, specifically in Jerusalem. Palestinians revolted in what was called the Great Arab Revolt, which was a massive failure in the 1930s, and it crushed any form of organized Palestinian resistance for many, many years. Then, as we know, in the 1930s and 40s, we have the Holocaust, which was one of the biggest influences, if not the biggest influence, changing the trajectory of the future of this land, where 6 million Jews were killed under the Nazi regime, and it increased the need for both the Jews and for the world, which now was organized under the beginning of the United Nations systems, to say we need to find a solution for this problem because this nation has faced the most horrible atrocity. And so the consequences meant an increased immigration to Palestine, and sort of the world opinion saying Palestine can be a good place for Jews to find refuge. There was a vote in the United Nations, which was in favor of the partition plan between the Arab residents and the Jewish residents. Now, at the time of the vote, 37% of the population of the land were Jewish. However, they were given 55% of the land. Before that, they had owned 7%. And there will be a map that we can visualize these numbers. So the Arabs and indeed the Palestinians rejected this plan very much. This led to the 1948 war, which is separated into two stages. One which is sort of in between the Zionist militias and Palestinians, and then a more conventional war between now the newly formed Israeli state and the Arab neighboring states around them. So this is the distribution of the land by population before the vote in the UN Assembly. You can see that the areas in red were owned by Palestinians. The areas in blue were owned by Zionism, the Zionist movement, and then the white areas were public or other land. So you can see for the Zionist movement, which embraced the partition plan, this was a huge gain, right? You get a huge territorial gain. But for the Palestinians, this was seen as a huge territorial loss. The partition plan, and the British are famous for bad partitions across the world, tried to sort of draw somehow states that would deal with the needs of this distribution. But as you can see, there's very few territories where you only have one group of people living in it. So if you look at the Tel Aviv-Jaffa area, this is the place where my family comes from, right next to that. So my family essentially lived in a land called Palestine, and then suddenly with a vote found themselves in a new country called Israel. And so many thousands of Palestinians found themselves in this situation. The area that is sort of has lines through it is the land that was eventually ended up as the West Bank and Gaza, as the Palestinians and other Arab nations lost the 1948 war and ended up with this reduced area. For Palestinians, we call the 1948 war the Nakba, the catastrophe. For Israelis, they call it the War of Independence. And as a result of this war, and indeed a plan called Plan D, that had the idea of how the Zionist movement could remove the Palestinian population and make way for an Israeli state. So the picture that you see here is actually a picture of Palestinians being displaced from my family's hometown, which is Lydda. So my family were not displaced out of Lydda because my family hid in a church, but for many of the people, and you can see some of them in this picture, they were not so fortunate. So around 700,000 Palestinians were forcibly kicked out, some of which fled as well, from their homes, which is the beginning of what we know as the Palestinian refugee crisis. This is a map just to show you the Palestinian villages that were depopulated and towns between 1948 and 1967. So now we discuss the refugees. For a long time between 1948 and 1967, Egyptian forces were in control of the Gaza Strip, and Jordanians were in control of the West Bank. And there was sort of this tense pause in terms of history. But in 1967, this all changed when Egyptian forces started mobilizing in the Sinai Peninsula. And Israeli forces attacked in a preemptive strike. And in 6 days, it's known as the Six-Day War, they conquered all of the Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. To a large extent, this is the reality that we sort of still have today. Obviously, the Sinai has been returned in a peace agreement to Egypt, but 1967 really is the sort of basis to the reality that we see right now. We'll jump through a few of these very quickly. Before I move forward in history, Joe, are there any burning questions for this period of time that we want to address?
So yeah, thank you. I've just posted in the chat, to post any of your questions in the Q&A section. And I don't see any there right now, but that doesn't mean that that folks don't have one. So I'm just zooming to look at all of the faces. You can either indicate physically with a hand or put a virtual hand up if someone has a question at this point on any of the content so far. Otherwise, we'll continue on, Jack. Just give it a minute or so.
And I know we're running through this very quickly, but this is attempting to squeeze in about 100 years in half an hour. So this is why.
And I'm sure as it continues on. So I don't see any hands up. And so there's one. So June, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I just put it in the chat. Can you talk about the King Crane Commission? Because I think that's important as well.
What about the King Crane Commission? Is there a specific question or?
Well, in reading it, I found it most interesting that at the end of the commission, that it was discovered that what was put in writing as far as the Balfour Declaration, not being prejudiced against the people in the land. So what was written and what was actually happening on the ground, they discovered was completely different. And I thought you might be able to expand on that, but maybe this isn't the time.
So there was this commission, and there were other also what were called white papers under the British mandate, which were giving sort of formal assessments of what was going on and advising the government what to do. And so absolutely there's, in all of these promises, there's a lot of really vague language about what exactly should happen to in the development of the land, what should happen to the people. And so indeed in the Balfour Declaration, it said that it shouldn't be on the expense of the residents that are already living there. But of course, in reality, the direction was to essentially favor a Jewish state, and that meant discrimination when it came to land purchases, economic support, military training, all these different areas, which, again, for Palestinians, they saw the British Mandate and the arrival of Zionism as an existential threat, which it ended up, of course, being. And so the conclusions of these very much support that fear and the reality that eventually came. Yeah, we can, maybe if there's more questions on that specifically, we can go further. But I hope that at least addresses it in part.
Thank you, Jack. Just last call. Does anyone else have a question or a comment to make at this point? Just you'll have to indicate that by a sign.
All right, let's proceed.
Yeah.
So with the 8 minutes that remain, we'll try and go through the past essentially sort of 50 years or more. So for Palestinians that were now living under an Israeli occupation, they eventually organized in two major uprisings. The first is the First Intifada, the first uprising, which was sparked by the lack of a Palestinian state, economic decline, and a brutal military occupation. And this was a mostly non-violent protest initially, which eventually became violent. It was led a lot by women's unions, labor unions, religious institutions. It was really across all of Palestinian society. And as a result of this uprising, we also have the Oslo Accords, which was allegedly the beginning of peace negotiations for an independent Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. The land in the West Bank was divided temporarily. I say temporarily, but it's still the reality today, into three areas that was meant to be interim while a peace negotiation was being discussed. The first is Area A, under Palestinian administrative control. Area B, which you see in green, which is joint Israeli-Palestinian control. And then Area C, which is the area in white, which is under complete Israeli control. And this is the reality that we still have today. Now, one of the issues with that is that it didn't really provide a solution. This so-called interim agreement never really provided an advancement for peace. And we have the Second Intifada, which is the second uprising. There's lots of reasons for it being triggered, but I think the main ones are a continuation from the First Intifada. The Second Intifada was a lot more violent. It was a lot more brutal, both in terms of the Palestinian resistance, which included things like suicide bombings, which was not so prevalent in the First Intifada, and then the Israeli use of firearms and warlike tactics, which were so much more brutal than the first. The current issues have not been solved since. And I want to go to something specific to keep in mind. And there's lots of aspects to discuss when it comes to this. The first is it's important to talk about settlements. So when people talk about the division of sort of Israel here and Palestinian land there, it doesn't really account for the Israeli settlements inside the West Bank and what used to be inside of Gaza, which was began in 1967. So it says around 530 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem today. The number is closer to 800,000 today, between 700 and 800,000 today. And the main issues around this is security, so violence, roads, checkpoints, which I skipped over, but we can return to. And settlements look very much like this. So you can have a land inside the West Bank, a hill, which initially there's a circle of Israeli settlers which will live there. You can see sort of the initial circle on top of the hill. And then it expands further down, taking in more of a Palestinian land. In terms of the geographical distribution of settlements, this is the distribution that we see today. The blue and purple circles are Israeli settlements. So I think sometimes when people think, oh, why don't you just go to this side and you go to that side, you can see that both communities are much more intertwined than one might expect. With the settlement, you have different roads that settlers can use compared to Palestinians. You have the separation barrier, which you see here, that is meant allegedly to separate between Israelis and Palestinians, but really sort of snakes in and out of the West Bank, taking in sort of more land onto the Israeli side. And there's a map that I skipped over that you can revisit later. Let's keep going. Because the last thing, and I think most important to talk about before Gaza, is what we understood as sort of the political status quo. And the way that the political status quo was understood is that the state of Israel had sort of three things that it wanted to hold at the same time. Democracy, being a democratic state, the land, but also being a Jewish state. And the analogy that I use here is the equivalent of having a hand inside of a biscuit jar, where you want to pull out all three, but you can only pull out two. So if you want to have a democracy, a real democracy, a full democracy, and the land, then you have to give everyone equal rights. That means you can't call it a Jewish state. If you want to have a democracy in a Jewish state, then you have to give up the land that Palestinians are living on. If you want to have the land and call it just a Jewish state, then you're no longer a democracy. And this is sort of the situation that we had been stuck in, perhaps until recently, where the Israeli government is now putting forward legislation to annex the land, to take in the West Bank, and under Trump's, well, I don't know how seriously you take it, but this idea of taking over Gaza, where the land and the Jewish state seem to be the biscuits that are more likely to be pulled out of the jar. And for many years, the situation has just been that the hand is in the jar in the hopes that something changes. But now we're seeing a shift in Israeli policy and a shift in Israeli opinions about this issue. Now, the information I have here on Gaza, we're not going to go into a lot of detail because we only have 1 minute left. But this was the information that I recorded before October 7th, 2023. So this is a few years before, where you have almost the entire population being refugees. It was at the time top 3, but before 2023, it was the most densely populated area in the world. Gaza's only water source was predicted to be irreversibly depleted by 2020, which is why Gaza is so dependent on aid in order to survive. And then essentially you had waves of, let's call them escalations of hostilities between Palestinian armed factions, mainly Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and with Israel. So the images you're seeing here is not from the past year and a half. The images you're seeing here is just after 2018. And so Gaza has faced this destruction, not to this level, of course, but has faced similar destruction fairly regularly, which means that the situation was so dire in terms of the amount of electricity per day, the water that's drinkable, unemployment, kids express no will to live, and many other issues. There's a lot that I've covered, and there's a lot that I've missed. I'm very conscious of the fact that this by no means represents, what people would hope for to be a complete image of the situation, but I hope at least that it's a starting point for people to try and understand that the violence, the suffering, the injustices that we see happening at the moment have not happened in a vacuum. They're not for simplistic things like good and evil, or this religion or that religion, but it comes out of a really complex and long history for both peoples. And so I think if we really want to try and bring healing and address this, we have to try and understand this as best as possible. So thank you so much for your patience as I've run through elements of our history and current situation. And I'm happy to talk about, any questions or any other issues that you have.
Grateful for you taking us through this this narrative, and so those of you who are on here, again, you're welcome to just raise a virtual hand or put your hand up if you have a particular comment or question. Stephen Finkelman, you've posted something in the chat, but your hand is up, and so would you begin with your question?
Well, thank you for letting me speak, Joel. I did submit 2 questions to you over the week, I think. I think that much of what Jack says is correct, but it is still basically a one-sided narrative. And I think many of the points, there was an opposite viewpoint. In order to understand fully from a looking for peace point of view, I think that one-sided narratives don't work. And I think one has to realize two-sided, there is a two-sided story here. A few very quick things that we may comment on. The British did promise an Arab state in Palestine, and at the same time they promised a Jewish state in Palestine. The Arab state was set up in 1922. It was called Transjordan, and the people who were in charge were settler colonialists from Mecca, that is the Hashemite kingdom. The British, although they promised a Jewish state in Palestine, they never actually set one up. It was the United Nations who proceeded with dividing the land. A few comments as has come up. In terms of the Nakba, Jack forgot to mention that perhaps a quarter of the Palestinians, maybe 150,000 plus or minus, did actually stay in Israel and now are Israeli citizens, such as Jack and his father, and I think have a fairly good lifestyle, so that one does have to recognize that there may have been some, in retrospect, some advantage of staying in a democratic state. The pictures of the refugees fleeing from Lydda, it's nice that Jack was able to hide in the church with his family, but the ones that were forced out of Lydda are quite reminiscent of some of the pictures of the 900,000 Jewish refugees that were forced out of the Arab lands. Again, that's the other side of the narrative. I once met a man, he was Palestinian, an Israeli citizen, lived in Jerusalem, was a professor of law at the Hebrew University, and he called the Palestinians a people of missed opportunities, whether it was with the UN partition plan, which they rejected. It's a pity that Jordan and Egypt, which controlled West Bank and Gaza for a 20-year period, did not establish a Palestinian homeland for their own people. There were various peace plans. President Clinton has commented on one recently. In 2005, Israel ended the occupation of Gaza. It did not solve the problem. There was an opportunity there for the government of Gaza to develop into a proper state with a high standard of living. And there were various Yom Kippur, October the 7th, which were possibly started by the Arab Palestinians. Unfortunately, they lost, and I suppose have to bear the consequences. I would also ask him directly, he listed all the horrible things in Gaza, which I agree. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. It's absolutely horrible. And blames it, of course, on the conflict and the Israelis. Jack, can you answer, do you put any of the blame for the situation of the Gazans onto their government, onto the Hamas government? Do they bear any responsibility for the situation? Thank you for letting me explain my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. If I could perhaps start with your last question first. Absolutely. I think that Hamas has been a brutal power. It has caused a lot of suffering to its people on a variety of different levels. On a few levels, I'll talk about some which perhaps are not covered as much in the Western media. Most Palestinians, if you look at polls, consider themselves secular, but Hamas has imposed a lot of religious restrictions on Palestinians in Gaza, which people have rejected. In fact, there were many protests before October 2023 by Gazans against the Hamas government. Hamas does not poll well on many different issues. Perhaps the only way that it polls well is against the Palestinian Authority. So absolutely, in the presentation that I put as much as possible the humanitarian facts, but not necessarily the political interpretations. Yeah. So I don't address political divisions within Israeli society. Sorry, Stephen, because you touched on a lot of things, and I also want to make sure that others have a lot of time. Regarding the narrative, yeah, I don't really agree. I mean, I understand that there's a lot of points that are definitely missed, but I tried as much as possible to deal with the historical events, the major historical events, and ones that the international community recognizes as being the most serious. So the Palestinian citizens of Israel are covered in this presentation. I skipped over them because of time, but I don't think anyone would describe, and I certainly wouldn't describe our situation as Palestinians in Israel as in the positive terms that you have, because I don't compare myself to people outside of my country. I compare myself to my neighbor who shares the same citizenship with me, but I do not share the same rights. In terms of when you talk about the end of the occupation in Gaza in 2005, there isn't a single government nor a single international legal entity that accepts that the occupation of Gaza ended in 2005. Because the test of whether something is under a military occupation is whether a certain country has effective control over that area. And all tests that have been put, including the International Court of Justice, have agreed that Gaza is still under a military occupation. We can debate how well or badly Hamas has managed that territory. I think that that's one thing. But to describe it as an area that could flourish when it was immediately put under a brutal siege, I think is not really, it's not really realistic. I think you could have put the most peace-loving government there, but under a siege would not have been able to flourish. Regarding the Nakba, in some cases forcible driving, in some cases the immigration of Arab Jews from other lands has nothing to do with me as a Palestinian. There's a historical, definitely way to look and examine that, but it has nothing to do with the Nakba. It is not an equal exchange of population, the way it is sound. The blockade is not just of arms, it includes of food. So for example, jam and chocolate for many years were banned under the siege. Wood, which extended beyond 2 inches, was banned from Gaza under the siege, which meant that there was people started stealing each other's doors because there's a shortage of wood, and many, many other items. Just the last thing that I would comment on, and then Joel, I leave it up to you to decide where we go with our last 2 minutes. The thing that the British were very clever with is they never promised anyone a state. They look at land that could be promised. So for under the Balfour Declaration, a Jewish state is not mentioned. A Jewish national homeland is mentioned, which is not the same legal category as a state. Now, you can argue that eventually the plan was to have a state. The reality is that it is a state. Maybe it's a bit of a moot point, but at no point did the British promise a state for the Jewish people. And part of that, I think, was juggling their own interests for the land, where they were hoping to have more direct control. I mean, I take your comments that there's definitely narrative here missing. No doubt, Stephen. And I think that I trust every reader, viewer, listener to fill in those gaps, but to use the presentation as a basis to engage. But thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm just going to offer the floor to others who might have a question or a reflection that they want to share. There are no more other questions posted in the chat. I appreciate this this dialogue and conversation. And thank you, Stephen, for posting other things that you have in the chat. Does anyone else have a comment or question?
Jennifer has put a question in the chat.
Okay.
But the UN in 1947 did offer 2 states. That is correct. The partition plan did offer 2 states, one which was supposed to be Israel and one which was supposed to be Palestine. But the Palestinians rejected this. I tried to touch on at least one reason. There are other reasons of why this was rejected. But one was that that the distribution of land was so obviously imbalanced that there was no way that any Palestinian society would accept it. So yeah, and after 1947, other ideas about how you arrange different states have been discussed. But since 1947 until today, so even in the Oslo Accords, which is considered the height of Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, an independent Palestinian state wasn't being discussed. It didn't reach that level. Even Yitzhak Rabin said, under his leadership, there will never be an independent Palestinian state. So certainly in 1947, that was the proposition that was put.
Thank you for that. I just wonder, in light of, again, the way in which narratives have been put together. You started your presentation by looking back to a time of peaceful coexistence. And it's really hard to imagine what it might take to achieve that. But do you see signs of hope at all in the midst of this season with a multi-generational conflict? Can you comment on that?
No, I don't see any signs of hope. I think that the situation of how the world has accepted sort of this situation that we have now in Gaza, the West Bank, and even for the rest of Israel, they've sort of accepted that this is the situation that we're in. We desperately need an intervention to where we are right now. If we keep going in the trajectory that we're going, many more people will die. Many people will be displaced and will lose everything that they have. I believe that there's hope because of my faith, but it's not something that I see, not in Israelis, not in Palestinians. I don't see hope. Again, as we're speaking, children are still being killed, shot, displayed in coffins. I mean, for me, it's just very hard to talk about hope in this period of time.
Jennifer, and I see that Kevin, you have unmuted yourself, but I can't see whether that's an indication you want to ask a question. Thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm because I'm involved with Women Wage Peace, and am aware of other civil society movements that are mixed, Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, as well as movements entirely Palestinian that work together across the various borders. So I'm curious. I just think their role is extremely important. I know everybody's exhausted and traumatized, and it's very challenging, but how would you try to encourage that? I mean, I realize you're an NGO as well and are the people speaking up. So I'm a Christian with Jewish background, so I'm sort of a mix, and am, have many Palestinian friends. So how would you try to encourage those of us from a long ways away, but who have friends in the land, to continue being a supporter to what's the good things happening there. I mean, I think both governments have huge issues, and there's also all the superpowers that are enabling so much of this. So as followers of Jesus, I think we need to be in the public square, and just curious how you see that. I hear your feeling of hopelessness, but just want to encourage you that there are people here who, they are continuing to address issues and trying to communicate with the other side in our own churches, on the streets and demonstrations. So thank you, Jack.
No, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for everything that you're involved with and do to encourage us and to encourage others who want to search for a peaceful way to solve this rather than one of violence. At the end of the day, what we have right now cannot last. It's not sustainable as a government, morally, spiritually, politically. At the end of the day, it's going to fall apart. And here we're going to return back to this word hope. The hope is that the people that you engage with, that I engage with, that we engage with, are going to be there to help pick up the pieces and to say that this is the alternative direction that we have failed to pursue, but the one that we have to now follow, which doesn't involve violence and dominating the other. Where Israeli, if I had to think about the future that I would want for myself, it's not a future where I'm isolated from another group of people. I don't want to be isolated from my Israeli friends that I've grown up with, and I don't want to be isolated from my Palestinian friends that live in other geographic areas. The system, beg your pardon, the system that we have at the moment is meant to isolate us. It isolates Israelis from Palestinians, Palestinians from Palestinians, Israelis from Israelis. It's all about dividing you into your group, which is the worst environment because it breeds the type of hate and ignorance and radicalization. So we depend on you, our friends, the people who care about all people who live here, to continue calling for justice, calling for peace, calling for reconciliation and healing, not for division. Justice, of course, is definitely something that we need and will need very heavily in the future. But without the international community, we will fall apart. We are falling apart. So this is why, in whichever way you're involved, you mentioned protests or supporting other groups, it's so crucial. It's so needed. And this is going to need an international effort to bring a better outcome than what we have now, hopefully a positive one. It's not going to be solved between Israelis and Palestinians alone, and Israelis and Palestinians are not solely accountable for what's going on right now. The church has a role, governments have a role, the international community has a role too.
Thank you.
Well, I want to sadly draw this to a close by pushing pause. The heartache of even taking time to discuss these things is that we too are being pulled apart to narratives that draw us away from one another, that some describe as just tribalism, in order to respond. But that polarization, we need to fight back on that. And so I'm grateful for what each of you have brought into the discussion this afternoon. And the words of Jesus, that in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world, are a way of understanding that when we experience the world's trouble, it isn't just escapism that will help us, but may we experience the peace that comes from actually knowing the one who is overcoming darkness, who has defeated death on the cross and is making all things new. But we live in this now and not yet reality all over the world. And one of the hardest things for me is to understand God's love for tyrant and victim alike, but in reflecting what's happening in the midst of conflict, that neutrality sides with the oppressors, and how we stand against injustice with the heart of God's justice and against the harm that is done to victims, and continue to pray that we would become instruments of peace and examples of hope, even when it's hard to reach for some, and that we lament the tragedy on all angles is also important. So I want to thank you for leading us in this discussion this afternoon, Jack, and for each of you taking time to participate together today. I know we have Phil Wagler on the call. He is our global director for the Peace and Reconciliation Network. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask if you would close us off in prayer. But as we heard, the work of Peace and Reconciliation Network spans around the world. We have a coordinator for Sub-Saharan Africa as well, who is dealing with a response of what's been happening in the Congo, the ongoing issues of the Sudan that Salim mentioned. He'll have somebody joining at his upcoming meeting. And here are just a couple of links if you feel led to contribute in any way to the work of PRN. It helps us do our work, which is to facilitate conversations like this one. I will also mention that someone from Musalaha, her name is Micah, she has training in international law. She and I are going to be among others who are presenting at a Christian Community Development Conference coming up in Germany in May. And that will be another avenue of support. If you want some more information on that, you're welcome to reach out to me. And I'll have some of these links and descriptions put together in a follow-up along with the recording of this session today, which will be sent to all of you. So I'm really grateful for a chance to keep the conversation going, keep these matters in our hearts and minds, and fuel us to both prayer and action. Phil, would you please close our time together in prayer?
Thanks, Joel. Thank you, Jack, and to all of you for participating. These are the types of conversations we need together, and so please join me in prayer. Gracious God, creator and giver of life, maker of heaven and earth, we worship you, and we thank you that you're good and just, faithful and true, and have made all people in your image. We pray as followers of Jesus that our lives would reflect your goodness, your peacemaking heart, your reconciling heart, and that we would see others as you see them. And so thank you for these, your people. I pray you'd bless them and keep them, make your face shine upon them and be gracious to them. And we ask this in your mighty name, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you.